right, so we're going to start talking about geologic time. Now, if you're super interested in this course, we do offer an entire class just on these next few lectures. Talking about, pardon? Yeah, it's called Historical Geology. So I'm going to go over pretty much that entire historical geology course in the next 4 lectures. I hope you have fun and stay awake. Daniel. Am I wearing penny loafers? No. I'm wearing, and of course this is going to go on the recording, I'm wearing these same black shoes I've worn for the past several years because Kmart went out of business, so I bought them all. And now I have many, many pairs of the exact same shoe because I don't like change. And now you know. So what we're going over is geologic time. The beginning of the Earth to right now. So I'm taking a lot of information and condensing it down. All right, so after about 4.5 billion years ago, that's billion with a B, the Earth was forming. There was a lot of cosmic dust going around the star, the central star of our solar system. That dust coalesced into planets. Gravity works by moving objects toward each other. So sort of the larger an object is, the more mass it has, the more gravity it has, and they get pulled into clumps. And as those clumps go through this cloud of dust, more clumps get on until eventually these, all that dust is sort of gobbled up by these big, large masses. No, not even close. Gravity is not just electronegativity on a larger scale. It's a totally different idea, totally different thing. You know who knows a lot about this? Physicists, and you might know some of them. So yeah, talk to them about how gravity works. Actually, it's kind of funny. If you ask a physicist how gravity works, they're going to make something up. They don't know. We know it works. We enter into what's known as the HADEAN aeon. Lasting for the first 400 million years of the Earth's existence, this was a hellish landscape upon which life would eventually emerge. It's been theorized, hypothesized, that the early Earth was actually pretty cool. And not like awesome cool, but like cold. Because there's been some evidence that there was liquid water on the Earth's surface. Now you guys know liquid water, right? It can't exist at too high of temperatures, it'll boil. There's some evidence that we found for this in Australia. In Australia we found these rocks called zircon. Zircon is a crystal that will only form in the presence of water. And these rocks were found in the same strata as rocks that we've radioisotope dated to 4.5 billion years. So it's very likely that early on in the Earth's history, there was liquid water on the planet. Now that kind of contradicts this hellish landscape idea of magma flying all over the place and it's so hot, while at the same time having enough water to create crystals. We'll get into how this is possible in a minute. So we have this idea of a cool Earth when these zircon formed. After that, the Earth was hit by a whole bunch of meteors. It was called the late heavy bombardment. So pretty much anything that's left out there. We have the planets, and there are a whole bunch of smaller bodies out in the solar system that had also collected a bunch of dust. Well, those smaller bodies, though small, still had a lot of speed to them, and they also had a lot of mass to them. They were pulled in by Earth's gravity. So as they're coming in, coming close to Earth, they get pulled in and start striking the surface. We can probably blame Jupiter and Saturn for this, because when in doubt, blame the big ones. Jupiter and Saturn are gigantic planets with massive gravitational pulls. So as they move through a densely populated area of the solar system, as they move through an area that's got a lot of rocks and debris in it, they're going to disturb them. Their gravitation will either pull or push them. Well, it'll pull, but then they're moving off, so those those astronomical objects got some speed to them. So they started moving. You can think of it almost like billiards. You've got a massively populated section of the solar system and this huge planet coming in through there. Now, some of those small planetesimals, these small objects, would have been pulled into the gravity of Saturn and of Jupiter. Others are just going to get scattered. We know that there are a lot of meteor strikes. There are 22,000 or more impact craters with a diameter of about 12 miles. So those are from the smaller strikes. 22,000 with a diameter of 12 miles. So, think of something that's 12 miles away. That's big. 12 miles. What's 12 miles from here? About 10-minute drive. Your house. There you go. A hole from here to your house. There are 40 impact basins with diameters of about 620 miles. All right, now we're getting big. Now we're looking at, let's see, 620 miles is 10-hour drive. So figure here to Pennsylvania. On Earth. Yeah, here. What? 600 miles? Depends on where you're going. Philadelphia? How fast do you drive? Yeah.
I go to Pennsylvania every year.
And okay, well, you've got some obvious skill there, because I can't do it. You got several impact basins with diameters of about 3,100 miles. Okay, 3,100 miles. Brace for this. That is about the distance from here to California. All right, so there's several. Think in the oceans. Think the shapes of a lot of the bodies of water we have. The Gulf of Mexico. What does it look like? Big hole, right? That's part of an impact basin. It's the top part of one. There's actually, likely it was centered near Panama. And then, so the rest of that, impact. So you've got a lot of impact basins. Some of them stack on top of each other. Now, with these bombardments, there were serious environmental effects. You figure a large rock striking the Earth big enough to make a hole from here to California will have serious impact. That will change the structure of the planet. These serious strikes, whether they were large ones that would cause huge impact craters or smaller ones on the scale of many, many, many nuclear weapons going off, would happen every about 100 years. Life didn't really have a chance to get off the ground at this point. As these kept striking and striking and striking, it kept changing the conditions on the Earth, and life couldn't keep up. Life couldn't adapt. At some point during the HADEAN, it's hypothesized that a very, very large object struck the planet. Now, by very large, I mean very close in size to the planet, a sister planet, coming in and striking the Earth. Now, at that point, as they collide, there's going to be a lot of rock vapor shifted into the atmosphere. Lighter rock gets ejected up, heavier rock coalesces. Does that make sense? So as these two large bodies hit each other, you have an ejection of light rocks, carbon dioxide, or carbon from pulverized rock going up into the atmosphere. Some of it had enough strength to leave the atmosphere. It was gone. It was ejected outward and began to coalesce into its own planetesimal, which may be where we got our moon. Again, I'm giving you hypotheses and theories. We can't say for sure, but it also that would explain why the moon is so much less dense than the Earth, why the moon doesn't have any lead in it, why it's primarily very light rock. But the big thing is, you've got the Earth now with this heavy rock vapor in the atmosphere. And it was hot. It was very, very hot. Likely the surface was molten. With high volcanic activity, lots and lots of strikes. The surface was inhospitable. Life could not get off the ground. The Earth got so hot that it passed the melting point of iron. That's pretty hot. Molten iron now. This led to what's called the Great Iron Catastrophe, and it led to the stratification of the Earth. You get iron molten. It becomes a liquid. So heavier masses, more dense masses travel toward the center of gravity. Less ones get pushed out of the way. Lead is very, very dense. So even when it was a liquid, it began to then seep through the cracks between the other rocks because it's heading toward the area in which it's there's the most gravity, the center, leading to an inner core of the Earth that's liquid iron. That displaced the lighter elements, so anything that was lighter than iron got pushed outward. So now we have this dense iron central core and then a mantle surrounding it of lighter material, finalized by a crust on top. Iron moving between these other rocks causes friction. And you guys have given somebody rug burn at some point in your life. You know it hurts. Heats things up. That friction further increased the temperature of the Earth. It kept getting hotter and hotter. So the outside of the Earth, primarily magma, the inside, liquid iron. So it makes absolutely no sense that water existed at this point. Yet, we have evidence that it did. And it all comes down to carbon dioxide. We're going to see over the next few lectures that carbon dioxide plays a pivotal role in the changing of the Earth's atmosphere. Rock vapor thrown into the atmosphere breaks down into carbon dioxide. It happens with volcanism, happens all the time. So rock vapor breaks down into carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a heavy gas. So if you've got all this rock vapor in the atmosphere, it's pushing down. The weight of that pushes downward. And that allows water to form even up to 230 degrees Celsius. So the more rock vapor out there, the more pressure you have. The more pressure you have, the more likely it is for water to form. You can be well beyond the boiling point of water and still have water form as long as you have a high enough pressure. It works in the same manner a pressure cooker does. If you were to cook with a pressure cooker, anybody ever cooked with a pressure cooker? All right, if you cook with a pressure cooker, you know that the reason you do that is because the water inside can get hotter than boiling, much hotter than boiling. That allows you to be able to cook faster and cook things to a different consistency. My mother used to love cooking with a pressure cooker. She still loves cooking with a pressure cooker. I had no idea, quite literally until I was married, that broccoli is supposed to be green. It always came out this sort of limp gray. But it's because it was always cooked at this much, much higher temperature than boiling. So you have differentiation. Then by that I mean you've got the layers of the Earth formed. You've got this heavy pressure. So at some point after that differentiation and a little bit of cooling, we're not having as much bombardment, it began to rain. Water began to condense, coming down from vapor to a liquid. And then it rained and rained and rained because water has that high specific heat, so it can absorb a lot of energy before it boils. So you're cooling down the Earth, getting these oceans forming. This is only able to happen because the orbital bombardment slows down. Most of the tiny planetesimals, most of the tiny bits of material that are in the solar system end up getting joined into one of the larger gas giants. So we don't have as many bombardments. Life has a chance. The early conditions for life were established. We have this reducing atmosphere, a lot of carbon dioxide, a lot of nitrogen, some methane in there, some carbon monoxide. So you can have lightning strikes with the reducing atmosphere allowing for organic materials to form and fall into the oceans. We have our venting at the Earth's at the vents at the bottom of the sea, where ions are being released into the water. These super hot ions allowing for the formation of amino acids and nucleotides. For more information, see that last lecture we just did for evidence on that. And that leads us to the end of the HADEAN. Any questions? Then we're moving into the Archean. Now we're going to get some life. Now we have evidence of life. During the Archean, we had 3 times more heat than now. I know this room is hot. It was a lot worse. The reason we have so much heat is because of leftover energy from accretion. The Earth was spinning very fast. There's a lot of kinetic energy in the Earth. A lot of kinetic energy from the Earth picking up that dust, friction. We have a lot of volcanism and an extreme amount of radioactive decay. Talked about radioactive decay in the last lecture. You're giving off energy. These are brand new minerals, newly emerged from the Earth. They're cooling down now, so they're decaying and releasing that energy. The important thing to note during the Archean is there's no free oxygen. Oxygen is, O2 is not in the atmosphere. There's plenty of oxygen locked away in the rocks. There's plenty of oxygen stored in silicon and in all sorts of other minerals, but it's not in the atmosphere. So it's during this point where conditions begin to stabilize and we have this liquid water that we start to see our very beginnings of life. Liposomes forming around nucleic acids, protobionts. During the Archean is where we found our first cells, and surprisingly enough and awesome enough, we have evidence, we have fossil evidence of these original cells. How cool is that to get fossils of cells? There's evidence that bacteria were abundant in the oceans. Simple bacteria. You see these mounds that start to form. Those are just layer upon layer upon layer of bacteria. So we have 2 kinds of prokaryotes that were established during this time frame. Very early, after we start seeing life and biological selection, Darwinian selection, moving from chemical selection, you get bacteria and Archeans arising. Bacteria and Archeans, as a group, diverged a long, long time ago. Here you have LEUKA, the last universal common ancestor. And you'll notice that early on you have a lot of horizontal gene transfer. So you have all of these organisms that evolve as a group. But suddenly you get 2 branches. The branch over here goes on to become bacteria. The branch on the right becomes Archeans. They split. It was likely the need for energy that prompted that divergence. Organisms need energy to survive. Typically, the Archeans are going to be autotrophic, and the bacteria are heterotrophic. So Archeans are going to be able to take inorganic compounds from around them and incorporate them into an organic compound. Sort of like how plants work now. Bacteria, they need to take in materials from the environment, organic materials from the environment. Now remember, earlier oceans were filled with this prebiotic soup, these organic molecules or pre-organic molecules. So they could absolutely go through and eat them. So then the issue became, which came first? The heterotroph or the autotroph? Well, there's an idea that the heterotroph might have come first because it's pretty simple to just pick up all of this free organic matter from around. It's laying all over the place, may as well just pick it up and eat it. At the same point, you have an argument that autotrophs came first because there are huge supplies of organic molecules and inorganic molecules that can be converted relatively easily. So you've got an argument for both. I propose to you, though, it doesn't matter. Simply because you have a split. You can't say one of these is older than the other, or one of these happened first or second, because they're happening simultaneously as they diverge. So the very first fossils we have, and by first I mean the oldest fossils we have, are of bacteria. If you look here, you see these sort of bumps. There's over some more bumps. Those bumps are what are called stromatolites. These are collections of cyanobacteria. Now cyanobacteria are going to play a huge role in changing the Earth. Probably one of the largest roles in the cause of one of the largest mass extinctions ever. Cyanobacteria are bacteria that can perform photosynthesis. They're autotrophic. What happens with photosynthesis? You guys know this. But you're right, you're making this, you're creating sugar, or you're creating some sort of organic molecule from the sun's solar radiation, converting that energy into the bonds of an organic molecule, and in the process, releasing a waste product, oxygen. These stromatolites, these cyanobacteria, began to grow in mats in marine areas that had lots and lots of calcium. So what happened was the bacteria were trapping the calcium. They grow in these mat shapes. Have you ever been by a creek and seen sort of this greenish stuff growing on the rocks? And you'll notice that it never gets washed away in the current. That's because it's held there with a substance called glycocalyx. That glycocalyx is acting as a glue, holding it in place. So as one generation of cyanobacteria grow, they adhere to the bottom, they start to, they turn green, they photosynthesize, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. They're removing carbon dioxide from the water because they need carbon dioxide, right? Plants, photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide and water. These guys are living in water that's filled with carbon dioxide dissolved in it. They're pulling that carbon dioxide out and combining it with the calcium to form calcium carbonate. So they're building, effectively, shells. They're trapping sediment. They're holding sand in place. So they start building these structures, getting higher and higher and higher, which brings them closer to the surface, which means that they're going to be able to get more energy from the sun. So they get bigger and bigger. One layer after the next builds up over thousands and thousands of years until you have these big macroscopic structures. These, we know these stromatolites form because they're still forming now. Off the coast of Australia, you'll see stromatolites like these getting bigger and bigger and bigger by taking in carbon dioxide, combining it with calcium, and forming these structures. It happened then, it's happening now. These have been around. It's not these exact ones that have been around forever, but the same strategy. But here's the kicker. This is the big, big takeaway here. So wake up, Ishmael, if you don't mind. Hey, Ishmael, this one's important. Okay, sorry, I had to wake you up for this part. So, organic molecules can be produced from atmospheric carbon dioxide. You could take carbon dioxide out and fix them into organic molecules. In doing so, cyanobacteria produce oxygen. You're doing two things at this point that are really, really important to the history of the Earth. One, remove carbon dioxide. It's called fixing carbon dioxide. And two, ejecting, releasing oxygen. That is absolutely huge and was a game changer. Up till this point, everything is anaerobic. What does it mean to be anaerobic? No oxygen, right? Once we're producing oxygen, that leads to a whole new era, a whole new age, where we switch gears and we're able to use that oxygen. But before we can use it, it ends up wiping out most of the things on the planet. Oxygen killed more organisms on the planet than any other mass extinction. This is called the Great Oxygenation Event. For a long time, those cyanobacteria just produced waste oxygen. It just built up in the water. Now remember, we got a lot of ferric sulfide in the water. A lot of iron in the water. What color is iron? Yeah, it's black. What happens, though, when iron is exposed to oxygen? It's rust, right? It turns red. So you've got oxygen now moving away from the cyanobacteria, interacting with the iron. The oceans started off as red. I'm sorry, they started off blue and these dark colors until that oxygen began to interact with all that iron, and then they start turning red. Eventually, all of the iron in the oceans combined with the oxygen. So the oxygen had nowhere else to go. It could not stay dissolved in the water. So where's left for the oxygen to go? Yeah, out of the water, into the atmosphere. The introduction of oxygen into the atmosphere by cyanobacteria caused a mass extinction. Anaerobic bacteria were broken down by oxygen. Oxygen's electronegative. Oxygen has a lot of electronegativity, and it breaks things down like crazy. So if you put oxygen out into the atmosphere, suddenly all those things around that weren't used to oxygen start dying. It's like breathing in an acid. It's not something you want to do. So these anaerobic organisms were forced underground, away from the oxygen. Anything that couldn't get underground or adapt died. Oxygen killed off a lot of things. But wait, there's more. Oxygen's not stopping it, just killing everything. Oxygen will interact with methane. Now, methane is what's known as a strong greenhouse gas. Have you guys heard of the greenhouse effect? Okay, basically, what's the greenhouse effect? Yeah, that's how most people know it, too. So, chemically, basically, here's what's going on with the greenhouse effect. You've got certain molecules, like methane and carbon dioxide. They are almost transparent to solar radiation. However, they will reflect thermal radiation. So if you've got the Earth down here, and you've got an atmosphere, what will end up happening is in this atmosphere you have carbon dioxide and methane and oxygen. Solar radiation will be able to penetrate. That solar radiation heats up the Earth. Make sense so far? Then the Earth will emit thermal radiation to the out into space. It will reflect some of it. Oxygen is pretty transparent to that thermal radiation. It'll let it right out. Carbon dioxide, a little bit transparent to it, but not very much. It holds much more heat in and reflects some back down. Methane, it'll hit methane and bounce right back. So what's happening is, when we have methane in the atmosphere, we're able to, solar radiation comes in, heats up the planet, and then that heat stays trapped on the planet. But when we add oxygen, that interacts with methane to produce carbon dioxide and water. Well, carbon dioxide will let out more thermal energy than methane. So the Earth begins to cool down. So that's basically how the greenhouse effect works. It begins to cool and cool and cool. The more oxygen produced, the colder it gets. Ice begins to cover the planet for the first time. And it stays there for a long, long time. With a lot of organisms dying, they can't tolerate that low temperature. The lower the temperature, the less kinetic energy. The less kinetic energy, the less work you can do. Only those organisms, it's hypothesized, that were able to survive in pools of melt ice, exposed water, or at the bottom of the sea could survive. Glaciers covered the planet. Now, glaciers are made of what? Not trying to trick you. Ice. And ice is what color? White, right? So if you have a planet, and you've got glaciers forming, white reflects radiation, right? Dark colors absorb it. So this white snow is starting to cover the Earth. And as it does that, it's reflecting radiation back out into space. So once you reach 25 degrees latitude, once the glacier gets that low, because it's reflecting so much energy, it begins to speed up its cool down. Does that make sense? You end up having more and more white areas that are reflecting more and more energy. Therefore, the Earth gets cooler and cooler and cooler. So life can either hold on in the melt ice at the very top, you get some solar radiation there, it melts it a bit, or deep under the glaciered sea. Luckily, we have volcanoes. I know, that's the first time you hear that. Luckily, volcanoes save the day. Because what they're going to do is continually put out carbon dioxide. As they erupt, they're putting out all of these greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide. And that leads to a greater retention of solar energy. Now, the cyanobacteria start to die off a bit because it's freaking cold. But with them going down, the level of oxygen begins to drop, level of carbon dioxide begins to go up. You begin to reflect less heat out into space, and it begins to warm up again. It's during this time frame when the Earth is cold and organisms need to become a lot more efficient with their energy that we probably had our earliest form of aerobic respiration. Now, with aerobic respiration, what's the key? What is absolutely necessary for respiration to happen, aside from oxygen? What? It's not light. You need to create, do you guys remember electrochemical gradients? You need to form an electrochemical gradient. You need that ATP synthase, or some sort of synthase to form. So you could have lots of hydrogen ions on one side flowing through to the other side where a phosphate gets attached to an ADP. By switching over to aerobic cellular respiration, you become 16 times more efficient at using energy. That's really important for keeping a cell alive in a frozen wasteland. This produces a lot more energy. So it's likely at this point we had developed aerobic cellular respiration. We start to be able to utilize this oxygen that's been killing us thus far. Once that happened, there's a huge selective advantage. So these organisms go on, they survive, they reproduce, life is good. It's also likely at this point that at the same point you're developing cellular respiration, you develop a nucleus. These eukaryotic cells form. Likely they formed from early archaeans. And there's a lot of evidence for that we'll discuss later in the course with the shape of the ribosomes and the different types of phospholipids they have and things like that. The modern genome of most organisms, of most eukaryotic organisms, is made up of both bacterial and archaean genes. Okay, this is going to be crazy, and you've kind of heard this theory before, but the idea is life isn't as linear as it looks. We can incorporate genes from other organisms into our own genome. We don't do it much now, but early on in Earth's history we did. What's that called where you can take in genes from another organism? Horizontal gene transfer. Very likely what happened is two organisms, a bacteria and archaean, were living close together. They were hanging out near each other and living together in mutual benefit. Both were supplying resources to the other, and both were getting a benefit from it. So here we've got the two cells, and this is not like, this is sort of artist interpretation. Two cells living close together, and they begin to fuse their membranes. They begin to work very, very closely. Eventually, one of the organisms gets absorbed into the other while retaining both genomes. So here you got two cells totally separate. One swallows up the other, and you've got two sets of genomes. Finally, over time, both sets of genomes get moved into the inner cell. This makes sense because what kind of, perhaps you remember, the nucleus is double membrane bound, right? In order to get a double membrane, a lot of thought went into the idea that one cell ate another and formed a vacuole around it. You get your double membrane. Moving the DNA to the inside of the single of one of the two areas protected that DNA and allowed for a more efficient means of cellular reproduction, of mitosis. There's a lot of evidence for this. You have one membrane that surrounded both organisms, and then one of the two organisms had two membranes around it. So you had one master membrane, one huge plasma membrane. It ate another cell, and that cell got incorporated into the second one. So once we have this archaean and this bacterial gene living symbiotically, endosymbiotically within each other, natural selection kept the bacterial genes for lipid creation, how to make phospholipids, how to make fats, and metabolism, how to break things down, while favoring the archaean genes for transcription and translation, how to make new proteins, things like that. We are very closely related to archaeans in regard to how we transcribe our DNA. But we're much more closely related to bacteria in how we metabolize foods, how we break things down. So you got the best of both worlds. This is that endosymbiosis theory. We thought last semester, we'll see it again and again and again. One organism living inside another organism to the benefit of both. What two other organelles may have resulted from endosymbiosis? The chloroplast and the mitochondria. Both, again, double membrane bound. Both with their own unique set of DNA. So for nuclear endosymbiosis, a bacteria was eaten by an archaean, but it was kept alive. We ended up with a nucleus. Selection happens, and you keep the best of both traits. We went on later, after we established this nucleus, the eukaryotes could have absorbed a cyanobacteria that was really good at taking sunlight and converting it into sugar. And that became the first chloroplast. It could have gone on, it could have had a brown algae that it swallowed that happened to be very, very good at aerobic cellular respiration. It was good at breaking down sugars. Swallowed that one, kept it alive, and then you have a mitochondria. So once we have eukaryotic cells, once we have the ability to produce proteins efficiently like bacteria, yet transcribe and translate ourselves like archaeans, we start to see a very quick evolution. Very quick changes from this unicellular form to multicellular, which is where we start to see our first multicellular life. In order to get multicellular, which is important, you got two strategies. You can either aggregate or divide and adhere. First up, aggregation. For cells to aggregate, you have two different cells created, from two different parents. They multiply, and they're just sort of hanging out. They would come together and stick to each other. Does that make sense? They sort of come near each other and hold hands. Then they're linked. That's one way to get multicellularity. Slime molds are like this. Slime molds are going to be composed of individual identical cells that come together to form multicellular structures. They are all unique cells all over the place. They're individual. They're going to move as single units until they get to a point in their development. They get a chemical signal from the rest of the body or that goes through the medium they're in that tells them unite. Then they begin to hold on to each other. They adhere to each other and form multicellular structures. That's one possibility. Another possibility is by dividing and adhering. This is the way we work. Our cells will divide. You undergo mitosis, and then after they divide, they still hang out together. They don't divide and go swimming off. They stick together. And we see a development of this in the volvicene algae. So in block A, you've got the individuals of volvicene algae, a very simple algae. These algae are unicellular. They don't hold on to each other at all. With B, what they'll do is they'll start dividing. It's another species of algae. They'll divide, but hold on to each other. So you're forming this multicellular structure. C, D, E, and F, you can see this colony growing bigger and bigger. As those cells divide, they grow and hold on to each other to form very large balls. Now, these cells are all identical still, but they're holding on to each other for adaptive purposes. They're holding on to each other because it's safer to hold on to each other than to be co-added alone. They've got their own mates right there. They can pass gametes back and forth. They're pretty big. Most things aren't going to try and devour them. Things like that. After you get them holding on to each other, after you get these cells adhering in some way, whether through divide and adhere or through aggregation, you get to what's known as differentiation. With differentiation, you start to create cells that look different from each other. To be truly multicellular, you have to have some cells that do some skill, some job and other cells that are adapted for other jobs. They have to differentiate to fulfill their roles. Your skin cells look different than your brain cells, look different than your stomach cells, yet they all originally came from that single zygote that was you. Does that make sense? Your zygote, you as a zygote, began to divide. And at some point, you went from being a group of cells that were identical to cells that were different from each other. So that's where we get multicellular life. We're going from dividing and adhering. We're going from a single cell to cells that are holding on to each other. We've seen the first evidence of fossils. We've seen the first evidence of stromatolites. And we know that bacteria existed. And then we had to go into not just how did these bacteria exist, but how do they cling to each other? And then how do they differentiate? Because once you get differentiation, you're able to get a lot more adaptation. Those differentiation genes, they're called Hox genes, body genes, are going to be extremely malleable, leading to lots of different body forms and an explosion of life, which we'll see in what's called the Cambrian era. Questions?